The November election is shaping up to be possibly the messiest one in U.S. history. It could lay the basis for such a profound crisis that it would threaten the stability and legitimacy of the political system as a whole, lead to violence on the street, and jeopardize the peaceful transition of power. All the problems with how the vote will be conducted, in person or via mail, and how the votes will be counted have raised the possibility that neither candidate would concede after Election Day, leaving the country divided and the world watching as the so-called global leader of democracy descends into chaos and confusion. Let me explain. Back in April, President Trump began a public campaign against mail-in voting, making the unsubstantiated claim that it will create a voter fraud scenario and result in a rigged election. This week, he encouraged people to send their mail-in ballots early and then go in and vote in person because this would quote-unquote verify if their initial vote was counted if they were turned away. Voting twice is, of course, a felony. Millions of Americans are looking to mail in their vote to avoid waiting in long poll lines that could lead to a new outbreak of the pandemic. Postmaster General DeJoy, while removing mailboxes and mail sorters, warned that the nation's mail system would not be able to meet ballot deadlines if mail-in ballots are sent too close to Election Day. And there's wide concern that it will take weeks to count the number of mail-in ballots. Republicans in many states are now launching their own attacks on what they call universal mail-in voting, meaning the ability for all eligible voters to cast ballots by mail rather than just those who can provide an excuse. And like in Texas, where the state Supreme Court has temporarily blocked the state's largest county from holding universal mail-in voting. This was a result of a lawsuit from the state Republican Party that said the Harris County clerk was, quote, compromising the integrity of elections by sending mail-in ballots to all its voters. Republicans in Illinois are also suing the state's Democratic governor, J.B. Pritzker, for promoting mail-in voting as ripe for fraud. Back in May, the Democratic-led state legislature passed a bill easing the voting process, including a measure to deliver vote-by-mail applications to around 5 million recent voters. So, what does the evidence say? An analysis of 3 vote-by-mail states in 2016 and 2018 by the Washington Post and the electronic registration found that only 0.0025% of votes were possible cases of double voting or voting on behalf of deceased people. And in the same vein, a study from UCLA's Voting Rights Project found most claims of voter fraud come from typos, voter mistakes, and clerical errors, and that voter fraud is, quote, not widespread, and that this is particularly true of mail-based voting. Now, amid Trump's continued insistence of fraudulent mail-in votes, his campaign is sending out mailings encouraging millions of voters to request a mail-in ballot in key battleground states, including Arizona, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania. But the issue has become so politicized that a recent poll found that only 11% of Trump voters plan to vote by mail, compared to 47% of those voting for Biden. Just think of the implications of this. This creates a possibility, even the likelihood, that the initial vote count on Election Day of ballots cast in person will show a huge Trump victory. Data collecting firm Hawkfish, founded by Michael Bloomberg and contracted by the DNC and pro-Biden super PACs, is warning that this will create a red mirage. In one scenario, Trump could hold a projected lead of 408 to 130 electoral votes with only 15% of mailed-in ballots initially counted. And once 75% of mail ballots were counted, the lead could switch to Biden's favor, a landslide victory of 334 to 204. So this would at least create the appearance for Trump to say the election had been stolen via fraudulent mail-in voting. And then you can spin out all the scenarios. Trump refusing to concede, armed Trump supporters showing up at government and vote counting offices demanding to see the ballots. In one scenario, Attorney General Barr could invoke federal rights to seize mail-in ballots since voter fraud is a federal crime. In some states, we could have state legislatures dominated by one party clashing with governors of the other party over certifying the results. Like I said, a mess. And that's not all. There's also a scenario where the Democrats challenge the vote and Biden refuses to concede. In 2000, Al Gore conceded despite winning the popular vote and considerable evidence of voter suppression in Florida. He was pressured to continue the ruling class tradition of the peaceful transfer of power and stand down. But would Biden do the same in the same situation? In this political climate, with all the maneuvers to purge working class voters, there's a distinct possibility that Biden would refuse to concede. Would Democrats refuse to recognize the Electoral College? Would they call on the military to take out Trump by force? Would masses of Democratic voters be mobilized in the streets? Does a House Speaker become the president? Does the Supreme Court get involved? The electoral analysts in the mainstream media are calling it a doomsday scenario, the unraveling of the American political and electoral system, the end of which no one can predict, even though we see it coming. And it's not all that far-fetched if there's not a landslide victory one way or another. For people in social movements, it's obvious that we're in an unprecedented situation. In a nation that calls itself the greatest democracy in the world and has deemed itself the global policeman of elections in other countries, say Bolivia, Venezuela, and more, the convoluted electoral laws and the breakdown of ruling class stability would open up a new stage of struggle. However things unfold in November, it's clear that people who are sick of this system will need to get prepared and get organized because it could enter its most paramount crisis yet.